Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the dramatic and, frankly, profoundly impactful life of Imam Malik ibn Anas. We're going to explore an incredible historical figure whose dedication to preserving history and truth demanded the absolute ultimate sacrifices. This really isn't just a story about ancient texts. It's a deep dive into human resilience, the true cost of integrity, and what it actually takes to build a legacy that lasts for well over a millennium. Picture this for a second. You're tied upside down to a beast of burden, and you're being publicly beaten in the streets, all because you refused to alter a single, seemingly minor legal ruling. Well, that was a brutal reality that this towering historical figure actually endured. But to understand how he got to that point and why he had such an unbreakable will, we really need to look at where his journey began. Section 1. The Price of Knowledge and Sacrifice in Medina. Growing up in Medina, the very city where the Prophet Muhammad had lived, Malik's early pursuit of knowledge wasn't just hard, it was defined by severe, crushing deprivation. He literally dismantled his own home, selling the wooden roof beams just to afford his schooling. His family suffered so deeply that, to hide their hunger from the neighbors, his mother would actually have their servant grind an empty millstone. She did that just so the neighbors would hear the grinding noise and wouldn't hear his young daughter crying from starvation. This is a man who sacrificed his family's basic shelter just for an education. And get this, he did this for 7 long years. For that entire time, he devoted himself completely and exclusively to one scholar, Ibn Hormuz. He wasn't jumping around from teacher to teacher. In fact, he was famously known for putting on short, padded trousers just so he could sit outside his teacher's door, protecting himself from the freezing cold stones while he waited patiently for a chance to learn. Whenever Ibn Hormuz's servant was asked who was at the door, she'd say, "Oh, it is only that ruddy-skinned one," and the teacher would reply, "Let him be. That is the man of knowledge of this people." Section 2. Masters and the Golden Chain. You gotta remember, Malik lived in a time way before printed books were common. Knowledge was transferred directly from one memory to another. So he gathered his knowledge using purely manual, physical methods. He'd be out sweating in the scorching midday heat outside the homes of scholars like Nafi, just hoping to catch them on their way to the mosque. And when he studied with another great scholar, Az-Zuhri, Malik would literally tie knots in a piece of string to keep track of the specific hadith, the prophetic traditions he was memorizing that day. He was completely unstoppable, and he never let the irritable moods of older scholars deter him from extracting the knowledge he was after. Looking at the historical timeline, Malik had a massive strategic advantage. Because he was in Medina, he inherited the pure, unfiltered practice of the city through an unbroken chain of generations, going right back to the Prophet's companions. By carefully selecting only the most reliable, scrupulous scholars to learn from, he became the ultimate inheritor of this chronological chain of transmission. All of this rigorous, almost punishing study resulted in what? The famous later compiler Imam al-Bukhari dubbed the Golden Chain. Whenever you see a tradition transmitted as Malik reporting from Nafi, reporting from Ibn Umar, you are looking at the absolute pinnacle of authenticity. It is universally considered the soundest, most ironclad chain of authority in Islamic history. Now, it's really fascinating to contrast Malik's environment in Medina with the approach of his brilliant contemporary Abu Hanifa over in Kufa, Iraq. Kufa was this highly diverse, bustling environment filled with complex new scenarios. So Abu Hanifa expertly navigated the law by relying heavily on rational deduction and analysis. But Malik, situated right in the cradle of the Prophet's city, anchored his methodology firmly in direct transmission and the continuous everyday practice of the local people. To Malik, the collective, established action of Medina citizens was a living, breathing historical record. Section 3. Reverence for the word. Because Malik was so deeply anchored in Medina, his respect for the transmitted word bordered on the absolute. If someone came up and just asked him a standard legal question, he'd step out and answer it. But to actually relate the traditions of the Prophet, that was a whole different ballgame. He would retreat to his quarters, perform a full ritual purification, dress in his finest garments, put on a turban, apply high-quality scent, and burn aloes wood. He wouldn't even begin to speak unless he was in a state of total physical purity and calmness, purely out of sheer reverence for the deed he was about to convey. Section 4. Forging the Muwaqqat. This meticulous care naturally culminated in his magnum opus, a book known as the Muwatta. It was the very first sound collection of hadith and Islamic jurisprudence to be widely circulated, and it was an absolutely massive undertaking. In fact, it was so brilliant that the Abbasid caliphs actually wanted to hang his book inside the Kaaba in Mecca and force the entire Muslim world to follow his specific rulings. But Malik impartially and wisely refused. He acknowledged that regions like Iraq had their own completely valid scholarly approaches. He wasn't interested in a monopoly on power. He just wanted to preserve the truth. And that brings us to Section 5, Truth, Trials, and Humility. Of course, his strict, uncompromising adherence to the truth eventually put a massive target on his back. At the time, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur and his governors were forcing people to take political loyalty oaths, often threatening to invalidate their marriages if they rebelled. When the governor of Medina covertly tested Malik on actions taken under coercion, Malik publicly insisted the divorce of the one under duress does not happen, and the authorities knew exactly what that meant. If a divorce under duress was invalid, then their forced political loyalty oaths were legally void too. Malik was explicitly commanded to recant, but he flat out refused to back down. Because of this, the governor had him tied upside down to a riding animal. He was paraded through the streets and brutally, publicly flogged until he lost consciousness. The beating was so severe that his arms were permanently injured, and he could never again fold his hands in prayer. And yet, incredibly, while he was being paraded and beaten, he courageously kept shouting his fatwa to the crowds. Whoever knows me knows me. Whoever does not, I am Malik, and I believe the divorce of the one under duress does not happen. This right here brilliantly illustrates the ultimate paradox of true scholarship. Here is a man who was beaten to a pulp for standing by what he knew to be definitively true. Yet despite being the single most knowledgeable man in the region, his absolute most frequent answer to legal questions was a massive, uncompromising admission of his own limits. Out of 20 questions, he might answer 2, and proudly admit his ignorance to the rest by simply stating, I do not know. There's this incredible historical anecdote that captures this perfectly. A man traveled for 6 grueling months, all the way from Morocco, to ask Imam Malik a specific question on behalf of his community. Malik listened thoughtfully and then simply said, I do not know. I mean, imagine making a 6-month trek across continents just to get an I don't know. When the completely shocked traveler asked what he was supposed to tell his people back home, Malik calmly replied, tell them that I do not know. He was so terrified of speaking incorrectly on behalf of God that he happily sent a guy on a 6-month return trip empty-handed. Talk about zero ego. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a pretty heavy question. We've seen a man who literally sold the roof over his head for an education, who took a brutal public flogging to protect the integrity of the law against Caliph al-Mansur, and who swallowed his pride to admit his own ignorance despite being an absolute master of his field. He understood the true, visceral cost of preserving knowledge. The question is, do we possess that same unshakable integrity today? What are we truly willing to sacrifice for the truth? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep seeking the truth, and I'll see you in the next one.